Good evening and welcome to Sage for H. Tonight we will focus on the future of global power dynamics. I'm honored to have two great scholars with me today, namely Sean Stars and Glenn Diesen. Welcome, Sean and Glenn.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start directly. Let us debate. Let us talk about unipolarity versus multipolarity. So I will start by asking a few questions to both of you and then some individual questions. So let's start with the questions directed to both of you. How do you define unipolarity and multipolarity, and what are the key characteristics of each system? Anyone?
Well, I can, I guess, jump in first. Multipolarity, unipolarity, this is all about international distribution of power because it's how many different centers of power of relatively similar strength states you'll find in the international system. Now, for most of history, it's been multipolar, but then we saw in the Cold War it became bipolar, that is two centers of power. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, again, you have one center of power, and now we see multipolar system emerging. Traditionally, a pole of power would be perhaps measured best in terms of military power. But now, over the past 200 years, I would say that's been increasingly more and more economic power. That is what is the and again, falls in within the geoeconomics. That is what kind of technologies, industries, control over transportation corridor, financial instruments such as banks and currencies. And this is how you largely would define a center of power. Now, it's important concepts because it to a large extent define the world order. That is under the during the Cold War with a bipolar international system. You only have the Soviet Union and the US. Now, in such a system, everything becomes very zero sum. If the US gains a bit, then it's a loss for the Soviet Union. So it's only two sides, and you end up fighting, of course, through proxies, as we learned. But in the unipolar order, after the Soviet Union collapse, it's very different. You only have one center of power, which becomes all dominant. And this impacts also how security is conceptualized, because usually in the international system, the point of departure would be that great powers have to recognize the security of each other. However, if in a unipolar system where security is based on the dominance of one actor, it doesn't need to take into consideration other large powers. And also in terms of economics, you can sanction anyone you want because there's no rival to your banks, your currencies, your technologies or industries. So there's a much so there's different rules of the game. And just to finish off, I think this is what we now see with multipolarity. Why it's becoming such a big shock to many in the West, because the United States is now learning if it doesn't also recognize security concerns of adversaries, as it didn't have to do the past 30 years, it will see these new poles of powers have incentive to work together to collectively balance the US. So the longer the US holds on to this unipolar dream, the more the Chinese, Russians, Indian, Brazilians, they all have an incentive to come together to develop alternative technologies, industries, transportation corridors, banks, currencies, grain exchanges, like whatever it might be. So it's a very different world that is emerging. And also we're discovering now with sanctions, as obvious with Russia, that if you put sanctions on Russia, they can just diversify. They can diversify with their economic output to the east. Europe is less capable of doing so. We see the same between the United States and China. In the 90s, just cut them off from their technology, and they wouldn't be able to function. Now, of course, they can develop self-sufficiency, they can diversify their markets, and they can reduce dependence on the United States. So this is new rules in the multipolar order, which is why it's a bit painful in the West at the moment to learn, I guess, the new rules of the game.
Okay, nice. Sean?
Yeah, so I would agree with that definition of unipolarity and multipolarity, except I would add that the United States is a qualitatively different kind of power since the 1940s. So I would add, from that traditional sort of realist definition, I would add a critical political economy perspective. especially on global capitalism. So how the US made global capitalism from the 1940s onwards and inserted itself in the center of various networks or structures of power in a way that no other power in human history has ever done. So while the norm before 1945 was the multipolar world order, I wouldn't even say that we were in a strictly bipolar order. I mean, at least certainly not in the capitalist world. In the capitalist world, it was expanding up until the 1990s, where the United States achieved its dream of a global capitalism. And so when we look at the US role within global capitalism, there's no other nation state in history and currently that comes anywhere close to what the United States has been able to accomplish since 1945. And I think drawing upon or making the distinction between structural power and relational power, which comes from Susan Strange in an article she wrote in 1987. So relational power is kind of the day-to-day, kind of daily diplomatic events that we read about in the news. And they fluctuate very, up and down. And, one thing can happen and then, a few months later, something completely different can happen. And then our image of, power changes just as rapidly with the daily news. So that's relational power, but structural power is the power to change the structures in which others must act. And Susan Strange said that in order to have structural power, you have to have power across 4 spheres. So that's security, production, finance, and knowledge. And you have to have dominance across all 4 of those spheres in order to have structural power. And so she, right in 1987, she said that Japan was rising in production, but didn't have any sort of independence and security because they relied on the US. And so even though Japan was beginning to challenge the US in terms of technology and production and so on, Japan didn't have structural power because they didn't have dominance across all 4. And the same thing with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had quite a bit of power in the security sphere, but not so much in production and certainly not in finance and knowledge. And so the Soviet Union also was not a peer competitor, and it wasn't really a bipolar world in that sense, in terms of at least when we're talking about structural power. And I think that's still the case today. So a multipolar world order is one in which there's no one overarching hegemon with structural power that can change the structure of the global political economy, and especially global capitalism as it relates to the contemporary period from the 1990s onwards.
What do you make of that, Glenn? Do you think we live in a unipolar world or a multipolar world?
I think we're living in a multipolar world, but compared to unipolarity,
Yeah.
yeah, well, no, I think it obviously was unipolar, and I don't disagree at all with what was just said. Again, well, one can expand on this. I mean, the U.S. the unipolar moment it had, it was it wasn't just economic and military. It went across all spheres. You saw the U.S. dominating the information space, the culture. Language itself, everyone's learning English. I mean, across, I guess, every measurement, the US has been quite dominant. So it's yeah, every main maritime transportation corridor. So no, I think this is the only time in human history you had one power which had such yeah, control over every corner of the world. It's quite unique, and again, this also impacted, therefore, the U.S. Well, an entire conception of how the world order should be organized, because they saw this as, well, this is a perfect time because now there won't be any more great power competitions because there can only be one, and and also the system could be more, I guess, tempered and improved because the dominant state was also a liberal democracy. So it also dominated the whole ideological space. That is, so no, it's without doubt it was. Has been unipolar, and yeah, that being said, I agree that in the bipolar era you can challenge to what extent there were 2 equal centers of power, because if we measure it in terms of economics, of course, there are 2 powers. One of them was a capitalist, the other one was a communist. This was very important because that meant the main adversary was to a large extent decoupled from economic statecraft, which is important when you shape these poles, but also it ensured a lot of solidarity within the capitalist bloc, because usually you would have some breaking loose, new centers of power emerging at the periphery, challenging the dominance. But because of this militarized great power rivalry during the Cold War, it incentivized a lot of cooperation between the capitalist countries in the West. So a lot of the usual economic statecraft, which would have fueled tensions and allowed the rivalry to emerge, it didn't happen to a large extent because there was a need to prioritize the Cold War conflict. So no, I very much agree with what was said.
Yeah, but today is a different world, you would argue nonetheless, though.
Today, oh no, now it's definitely multipolar.
Mm.
I think this is quite evident. I think the world has three superpowers now, or great powers, which would be the US, China, and Russia. I think they underestimated the Russians, but a good indicator of being a great power is if the most powerful state in the system throws everything it has at you, and you're still able to stand on your feet. I think this is more or less a definition by Mersheimer once that this is a good indication. So if we see the military, the economic pressure, the efforts to isolate it, and nothing works, that's a good indication of being a great power. So this is so I think these are the main three great powers. I think India has a huge potential, but it's not really quite there yet. It hasn't really asserted itself to the same extent, and but no, I think it's clearly multipolar, but it could risk devolving into a bipolar system if it just becomes the US and the Chinese, which is why I think a lot of other countries now, the main difference between bipolar and multipolar is the extent to which other states in the international system are able to diversify. This is why I see, for example, the Indians and the Russians trying to connect more. So again, all roads don't lead to Beijing, that they don't become excessively dependent on a more powerful actor, because then the whole multipolar system might begin to fall apart. So but this being said, I think we're moving in the direction of multipolarity, so far at least.
Okay. So, Sean, I mean, China's rise, Glenn mentioned China. How does the rise of China challenge the concept of unipolarity? Do you believe China's technological and military capabilities are sufficient to alter the current global order?
No, so I argue that the way in which China has risen over the past 40 years has actually increased US structural power, particularly in two ways. So finance and production, so technology. I mean, finance is fairly easy. There's only one global currency. And so every exporter accumulates US dollars. And so every time an exporter, whether it's China or the Gulf states or Germany or Japan, when they're exporting, the central banks are accumulating US dollars, and they have to park those dollars in a global safe haven asset, which is the US Treasury bill. And so they're structurally bound to basically give the United States free money. So the US created a global financial system from the 1940s, but particularly from the 1970s, and until now, in which China, which is supposedly the US's primary geopolitical rival, is structurally bound to fund, is the largest foreign funder of the US government. I mean, it switches between Japan and China over the past 10 years or so, but either China is either the largest or the second largest foreign funder of the US government. And so China is structurally, by the structure, because the United States has shaped the global financial structure in a way in which they don't have to ask China to fund US warships going through the Taiwan Strait. The US just designed the global financial structure that way. And China, if they want to participate in global finance, which they absolutely do, then they're forced to give the US free money. So the US is a qualitatively different state. It has been since 1945, and it continues to be today. And in terms of technology and production, so the way that China has risen in the past 40 years has given the US more tools. So for example, there's a chip war going on right now. The United States is trying to contain the further technological rise of the advanced Chinese semiconductor sector, and they have a number of tools that they didn't have in the first chip war against Japan in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, Japan actually surpassed the United States in global sales in semiconductors. So by 1985, I think, Japan reached over 50% of world sales in semiconductors. And so Ronald Reagan slapped 100% tariffs on Japanese semiconductors, negotiated directly with the Japanese government to force the foreign share in Japan to increase to 20%. And he did an industrial policy of $500 million and created Sematech, which is a public-private partnership between about 14 American semiconductor firms. So that, and then the U.S. defeated the Japanese competition in semiconductors by about the mid-1990s. The U.S. has become back to number one, and still today, the latest data from 2023 is that U.S. semiconductor firms account for 50% of the world's sales. But so today, precisely because of the way that China has integrated into global value chains at the lower end, and where the U.S. firms maintain the intellectual property, the most advanced segments of the value chain, and the way that American corporations have split up the value chain means that China's technology is dependent on U.S. technology. And so the U.S. can weaponize that dependence, China's techno-dependence, in a way that the U.S. couldn't do against Japan in the 1980s, because Japan arose more or less by protecting their own technological development. So they weren't dependent on the U.S. in the way that China is today, right? So the way that China integrated into global supply chains as workshop of the world is by being dependent on American technology. So this is why, and of course, U.S. allies are also dependent on U.S. technology in semiconductors, which is why the U.S. can pressure the Netherlands and Japan to also implement export controls against China. So in those two ways, in the finance structure and the production structure, at least with advanced technology, with semiconductors, the way that China has risen has actually made the U.S. has increased U.S. structural power. So the U.S. is, in my opinion, in those two ways, is more powerful today than it was, in the 1980s, 1950s, because of course the U.S. couldn't do that against the Soviet Union either.
Yeah, no, I see it very differently. I won't go as far as to say you're wrong, because I think we have different theoretical assumptions. But I guess I have different expectations. But again, I could be mistaken. Now, I think a lot of the structural power will go away, I think, over time, simply because a lot of this was built into the whole concept of a very liberal international economic system. Now, you mentioned in the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9, I think this was a huge wake-up call for the Chinese, because this is when they saw the United States borrow too much and spend too much into crisis, and when they were looking for the US to restore some fiscal discipline to preserve the current system established after World War II, they got the opposite. They heard Americans say, no, listen, you have to either buy more debt so we can continue borrowing and spending. Otherwise, we will get it from the Federal Reserve. So either lend us more, or we'll inflate the currency and reduce the value of your existing investments. So at this point, I think the Chinese began to break a bit away from, they had outgrown the US led international economic system, which gave the US all of this structural power. And this is, I think, quite important, because from there on, you saw the Chinese beginning to push this Belt and Road Initiative from 2013, that is to establish the more independent or autonomous transportation corridors by land and sea. So by 2015, the Chinese had this China 2025, which had this ambition to take over key leadership in the main technologies. And you also see, of course, the gradual dominance in a lot of industries. And also from 2015, this is when they developed the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. You see developing more, beginning to trade more in national currencies. And overall, you see a greater and greater decoupling. And so I guess where my expectations would differ is that a lot of the US power was built up around, again, this liberal international economic system. But I guess my theoretical assumption is that when hegemony is in decline, it doesn't anymore have the incentives to provide the openness in which others accept that it has administrative control over the international economy. So it's more likely then to use its administrative control to prevent the rise of rivals. And I think this is what you see the US doing now. And this only incentivizes China as well as other great powers to reduce dependence. Now, and I know what the Americans were able to do with Japan in the 1980s, but I think this is, to a large extent, it was also the Japanese dependence on the United States that they could put this pressure on them. The Chinese won't fold to this kind of pressure. Also, I think it's too late. I think they could have broken China in the 90s or prevented its rise. But as you see now, China's become quite self-sufficient. If the US tries to deny semiconductors, the Chinese can develop self-sufficiency, and they're catching up and even in many areas surpassing the United States, and this is being done at a great speed as well. So I see the economic dominance again of the US unparalleled in human history, but a lot of this the systems which are set up after the Second World War, it's the main objective, the way I see it from the Chinese now, is to develop new parallel institutions to reduce this dependence on the United States. So at least this is my expectations that the US has already peaked, and again, an entirely new international economic systems being developed to accommodate multipolarity, because the former US system was all too US centric. So this is why I think we're living in a bit of an era similar to the time before World War One. That is, at that time, the Germans had outgrown the British-led economic system, and I think now the Chinese has definitely outgrown the American one.
Okay. Doesn't that make sense, Sean? What do you make of that? I mean, we have Made in China 2025. We have the increasing self-sufficiency. We have the increasing technological capabilities of the Chinese. They're developing their own ships now and so on. They're the biggest trading partner of almost all countries in the world. They have the Asian Investment Bank and so on that was mentioned, the BRI. I think it's in terms of in many different financial metrics, it is the second state in the world next to the United States. So what do you make of that? Doesn't that change the narrative a bit?
Not for me, no. So I absolutely agree that China has the incentive to challenge U.S. global dominance. I mean, Xi Jinping has said it many times, including with Putin, that we want to aim towards a multipolar world order and so on. So they absolutely had the incentive, and they definitely made many efforts towards that 10 years ago, which Glenn mentioned. So the Belt and Road Initiative, Made in China 2025, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and so on. But I think we can go through each of those, and we can see how the U.S. has responded, and whether these are really a challenge to the United States. So, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. So I absolutely do believe that Xi Jinping's goal was to reorient global trade, or at least in Eurasia and Africa, reorient the trade towards China. And most importantly, Western Europe. So China did, a charm offensive with Western Europe, and with David Cameron, for example, in the UK, announced a golden era. After he invited the Dalai Lama to 10 Downing Street, but after there was like a freeze, he apologized and so on, and he announced a golden era between the UK and China. Italy joined the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In fact, the UK itself, and Obama complained about that, complained about the UK's constant accommodationism of China, complaining that the UK also joined the AIB and so on. So there was momentum in that direction. And then the 17+1 grouping in Central and Eastern Europe, so 17 countries in Central and Eastern Europe with China, right? So there was definitely momentum in that direction. But we have seen since around 2019, the US, whether by design or by luck, we've seen that a series of events happened from 2019 onwards, and we live in a very different world now. So let's take Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, actually, Chinese investment in the BRI actually peaked in 2016. And it's been going down. It's been declining ever since, and especially since the pandemic, as China closed itself to the world for 3 years. But the largest recipient of Belt and Road Initiative funds was to Pakistan by far. So the China-Pakistan economic corridor was to try to get around the Strait of Malacca. So, 80% of China's oil goes through the Strait of Malacca. US has a Navy base in Singapore. They can easily block it off. And so China wanted to build pipelines from Xinjiang to Gwadar port in Pakistan, right? So Pakistan was by far the largest recipient of BRI funds. Pakistan had one of its worst financial crises in decades, just a couple of years ago, with crazy inflation, et cetera. And China didn't bail them out; they went to the IMF, right? So they got an IMF structural adjustment program, and this makes sense because why would China want to bail out Pakistan when they can just let the IMF do it? And so the AIB, even though they're a huge investor in Pakistan, et cetera, it played no sort of alternative role, or let alone a challenge to the IMF, the US-based, Bretton Woods system. And in fact, the AIB, since 2022, they've actually cut off dollar financing to Russia. I mean, like Russia, there's supposed to be this no limits friendship, and China is more or less respecting US sanctions on Russia precisely because Chinese banks want to continue to use the US dollar. They want to continue to do business with Wall Street and so on, because Wall Street is by far the center of global finance. So, and in fact, even in the AIB's constitution, in the Articles of Agreement, they say explicitly that they want to complement the IMF and not challenge the IFI, the international financial institutions. In terms of made in China in 2025, so definitely China has made huge leaps and bounds in electric vehicles and batteries, obviously solar panels, wind turbines, et cetera. And that's, especially electric vehicles, that's very noteworthy. But in terms of semiconductors, so I'm doing research in semiconductors because semiconductors are the foundation of all electronics, right? And so if you have a chokehold on advanced semiconductors, you have a chokehold on artificial intelligence, on supercomputing, quantum computing, et cetera, et cetera. So even before Made in China in 2025, Xi Jinping announced the Big Fund in 2014, where he announced, like, I think it was $20 billion of subsidies in the Chinese semiconductor sector at that time. And then the Made in China in 2025, their goal was to have 40% domestic self-sufficiency for semiconductors by 2020, and then 70% by 2025. So we're in 2025 right now. The top range is 16% self-sufficiency. So China is the world's largest importer of semiconductors. So China imports more semiconductors than even oil. But only 16% of its market is produced within China in 2025. And of that 16%, most of it are foreign firms such as Samsung, TSMC, SK Hynix, and Intel. And so if you only look at Chinese firms producing semiconductors in China, it's 6%. Okay, so the goal in 2015 was 70% in 2025, 40% in 2020. It's today 6%. And that's in large part because of the US export controls, which have been incredibly effective. So because of the way that China has risen, China is techno-dependent on the US, and so the US can cut off its access to the most advanced chips. So and then in terms of the connecting China with Western Europe, I mean that was blown up by the protests in Hong Kong in 2019, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the sanctions decoupling Russia. So like its high-speed rail route from China to Duisburg in Germany, that was cut off. And then of course, so there's basically three routes that China planned from China to Western Europe. So that was through Russia, through Iran, and Iran obviously has been under sanctions for even longer, over 10 years, and then around India through the Persian Gulf. But a couple of years ago, the G20 announced the India Middle East Economic Corridor to compete with that route. So basically, China's three routes to Western Europe geographically has been under pressure, but also politically, Western Europe is, I mean, the what's her name, Kalyas, or
Callas,
yeah. I mean, Glenn knows more than I do how much of a lunatic she is, and making sure that China and Russia remains the enemy, right? I mean, so that project of uniting Western Europe and China and carving Western Europe away from the US, that's completely failed in the past few years. And so again, China definitely has the incentive, and obviously Russia has the incentive, but we have to look at their capacity, their structural capacity in production, finance, security, and knowledge. And I think if you look at all four of those spheres, China doesn't have anywhere near. I mean, there is no structural power. Chinese structural power, right? I mean, there is no Chinese structural power, whereas there is U.S. structural power. So certainly China has the incentive, but it does not have the capacity.
Let us continue with the concept of the Eurasian world order, because you have written a lot about that, Glenn. How does the Ukraine war symbolize a shift towards a multipolar world order or a Eurasian world order? And what are the key indicators of this transition?
Well, I think the Ukraine war is both a consequence of the failing unipolar world order, and it also helped to intensify the shift towards multipolarity. Now, if you look in Europe, the decision to begin to expand NATO in the 1990s, it was very directly linked towards the efforts to establish unipolarity. Keep in mind that initially we had agreements for a pan-European security architecture with the Russians. Now, if you bring the Russians into Europe, then you can't have one center of power anymore. The reason why you expand NATO is to preserve the alliance system. It feeds into the hegemonic structures, because now the Europeans will be dependent on the United States, and they will help to marginalize or contain Russia as an alternative center of power. Now, NATO obviously is military by nature, but the whole idea then is get the entire Europe into the same military bloc under US leadership, and then have the largest country in Europe, which is Russia, standing on the outside. And this alliance systems, it's what a unipolar hegemonic system depends upon. It's this alliance systems, which is why we couldn't overcome it. Of course, there's also economic aspect of this, which is if you want unipolarity, this is you want to have asymmetrical interdependence. That means you want others to be dependent on you, but you should be less dependent on others. And again, this is also the purpose of the EU, by the way, to have a lot more collective bargaining power to skew the symmetry. Now, this is, by the way, also something that the EU is now worried about China. They're saying, oh, well, everyone becoming more dependent on China, but China doesn't want to be dependent on others. And exactly, it's because this asymmetry is where you get political power as well. So no, I think this was obviously the source of the war, the attempt to continue to bring the military alliance closer and closer to Russian borders, to put more and more pressure on Russia. But what is interesting is that in this war, the alliance has more or less been defeated. That is, there's no more weapons to send. Russia's winning on the front line, and as a result, now you see these cracks emerging within NATO. And I think this will only increase in the months and in years to come. So you can see what would be other consequences of NATO's defeat. I think it's also, you see in the economic sphere, that is the efforts not just to defeat Russia on the battleground, but also isolate it economically in the world. All the sanctions, the theft, for example, of its sovereign funds. This is something that has shook the world. Who wants to park their money anymore in Western financial system? So you see now more scramble for alternatives. The attractiveness of BRICS, for example. I think this is, the world sees that this is it's an ideal situation now to diversify, because once you have a multipolar international system, you have the opportunity to diversify your economic connectivity. If you can diversify your economics, then you can enjoy greater political autonomy, which is why countries around the world are seeking this diversification. And this can be accommodated in institutions such as BRICS. And again, even allies of, or not allies, but let's call it friendly states of the West, be it India, they will be concerned now, because they don't want to ask Washington for permission to buy energy from Russia or trade with China. So they seek their own to diversify as well, to become less and less dependent on the West. And I think this is the direction the world is going. And so the countries who are not diversifying now, I think they will be punished by the system, which is why I see, for example, the Europeans. What you want to do in a multipolar system is to again diversify economic ties, and instead the Europeans are reducing ties with Russia, China, and making themselves more dependent on the US. This is quite foolish now. They have more and more dependence on the United States, hegemon in relative decline, which is also shifting its priorities towards the Western Hemisphere and Asia. So now that puts the Europeans in a very vulnerable position. So I think it's not sustainable. Again, you mentioned before the Europeans not connecting anymore with China and the Belt and Road. But I think this will be punished. They will have to change their economic policies, otherwise they're going to become less and less relevant in the international system. So no, I think the Ukraine war has been a huge influence on this, and it wasn't just Russia. I think the Chinese, they also saw what was happening. They know that they could be next in line, that you can cut off their access to key industries. They can try to constrain their shipping to reach ports around the world. Their banks can be cut off. They can reduce their access to SWIFT. Their money parked in American banks could be stolen. So this is a huge, the trust in the hegemonic system, that is where the US leads the global financial system. It's that trust is gone, which is why you have this scramble now for alternatives. And I would just add that that it's proven now that it is dying. Indeed, Marco Rubio, he came out only a few weeks ago in this interview with Megyn Kelly, and he said, well, unipolarity is over. This was always meant to be a temporary time. It's not natural, and now the multipolarity is here. And this is why the US is making huge shifts, because if you recognize that the world is multipolar, what do you do? Well, first you have to you start to prioritize further. You can't just go against all the major powers. So now they're trying to make friends with Russia to make sure that these other poles of power, be China and Russia, aren't pushed too close together. They're also realizing they have to prioritize more, which means that they can't put that much focus on Europe. It's not that interesting anymore. They want to again look more towards Asia. So you see already huge shifts and recognition that this international or world order established after the Cold War based on unipolarity is gone, and Ukraine killed it. So I think there's a very close link there.
Okay, so what do you make of that, Sean? Don't you see those patterns of diversification, the patterns of new alternatives, new trading, trading in national currencies, even American politicians themselves recognizing that unipolarity is over? What do you make of those? What do you make of that?
So I think what's been happening over the past 3 years shows the incredible power the United States has. I mean, the only thing that has stopped the United States in Ukraine is the United States, right? I mean, you had the populist right. The Ukraine war was one of their cause célèbre, and so Trump is pressured to negotiate peace with Russia and Ukraine, right, to end the war. Although, I mean, lately I'm not sure. Momentum seems to be losing a little bit. When Trump is demanding a ceasefire before a peace negotiation, et cetera, it's not very helpful. But anyway, the only thing that stopped the United States in Ukraine is the United States. And so if Kamala Harris was elected, they would have kept killing Ukrainians, right? I mean, and obviously the whole of Europe supports this effort to continue to kill Ukrainians to weaken Russia, right? So I mean, Russia did not defeat NATO. I mean, so NATO couldn't defeat Russia militarily in Ukraine. That's certainly true, and Russia obviously is winning the war on the battlefield. But the U.S. could have continued to throw Ukrainian men at this in the meat grinder. It was only the political situation in the United States that ended the Ukraine war. So what did the Ukraine war do the past 3 years? It unified NATO to a degree that we haven't seen in decades. I mean, even South Korea, Japan, and Australia joined the NATO summit in Madrid in what was it, 2022 or 2023, drawing Northeast Asia into this. And so, for the first time since maybe 1920 or whatever, when the U.S. was supporting the White Russians, The U.S. is directly, I mean, almost directly via proxy, fighting a war with Russia, right? I mean, this never happened during the Cold War. And ideologically speaking, if we're thinking about knowledge, the ideological structure, one of those four structures that I mentioned that we have to think of have a complete picture of structural power. Liberal and neocon ideology, at least among the elites, is just so incredibly dominant. That there's still the Western Europeans still want to, at least Macron and Starmer still want to keep fueling this Ukraine war, right? I mean, remember, it took a while for Biden to convince, especially Germany, to send Leopard 2 tanks and to cut off Nord Stream 1 and 2, which is, of course, why the U.S. had to bomb it, because Germany was talking about reopening it in the summer of 2022. And now, Russia is offering to fix it and reopen it. And Germany now is saying, no, we don't want to reopen Nord Stream 1 and 2. So the ideological power that the U.S., the liberal neocon U.S. ideology has in the Western alliance is stronger today than it's been. And of course, NATO has expanded with Finland and Sweden and so on. And then, I mean, we could say similar things with Israel. I mean, the fact that the U.S. can, run a genocide through its proxy Israel with hardly any liberal, having a problem with it or even talking about it, is an extraordinary amount of ideological power that the U.S. has with these two wars, Ukraine and the Gaza genocide. So Marco Rubio said that we live in a multipolar world order, but I don't know if Trump got that message. I mean, certainly, bombing Yemen again, they're moving B-52 bombers, et cetera, to Diego Garcia and so on. It seems like they're ramping up to at least seriously threatening Iran. One of the reasons, so you have the domestic political situation in the U.S., but another reason why Trump wants to end the war in Ukraine is to, I mean, Marco Rubio also said this, is to move more troops to East Asia, right? To pivot to East Asia for China. So the United States certainly doesn't accept any challenge to its power, to its immense structural power. I mean, they would rather fight World War III than accept any real challenger. And I think China knows that, which is why not only are they following, they've been following more or less U.S. sanctions on Iran. They've also been following U.S. sanctions on Russia more or less. Like I've been saying, like they haven't been giving any military weapons to Russia at all. Despite the BRICS supposed solidarity and so on. So I think the Ukraine war has really shown how the U.S. can unify the West, including Northeast Asia, Australia, et cetera. Like I said, the only thing stopping the U.S. and Ukraine was the United States. Like it wasn't Russia. So at the last BRICS summit in Kazan, was that November last year. Before the summit, Putin was really making a big deal about having a BRICS currency and a BRICS alternative to SWIFT and so on. But by the end of the meeting, I mean, there was almost no progress, certainly not a BRICS plus currency, because China wants to internationalize its own RMB, right? I mean, they don't want to give up they don't want to have a common fiscal policy and so on with the BRICS. I mean, just look at the European Union, the 30 years of the euro. I mean, one of the reasons why they haven't been able to get above 20-30% of global reserve currencies is because they don't have, I mean, they're much more geopolitically aligned than the BRICS plus, but they still are each, especially the major powers within the EU, are prioritizing their own national interests above the collective EU interest, which is why they don't have a common foreign policy. They don't have a common European defense force. And their currency is not a serious contender to the US dollar. The latest data I saw from the IMF is from the third quarter of 2024. China's share of global currency reserves is about 2.5%. The Canadian dollar has a higher share in global currency reserves than the Chinese RMB. I think the RMB has surpassed the Swiss franc now, but the Japanese yen and the British pound are still like 2-3 times more in use than the RMB. And so there's just, the Chinese central bank said in 2009 that they want to de-dollarize and move towards an alternative currency regime. And that was over 15 years ago now. And China's RMB is still about 2.5% of global currency reserves. So there's just, again, the intent and the incentives are all there, but they just don't have the capacity to have a serious challenge to U.S. structural power.
Uh, well, I guess, well, just on the war, I would say that, no, well, again, I would disagree on this. I think I would consider NATO to have been the defeated. That is, that there's not any more weapons to be sent. That is, even Biden admitted this towards the end. This is what the reason he was sending cluster ammunition, because they didn't have any more artillery shells to send. Also, the weakening of NATO's position on the battlefield is also why they had to escalate as well, which is what we saw from the beginning when Biden warned that F-16s would mean World War III. Meanwhile, towards the end, we saw Biden actually using launching long-range missiles into Russia that is operated by Americans, so effectively being an American attack on Russia. So I thought we were reaching the end there, because there wasn't that many more avenues for further escalation. So not only has the weapons been run out, of course, NATO could send troops in as well, but that would be more or less World War III. In terms of industrial capacity, I think that the Russians had more ability to boost their industrial capacity. They can outproduce all of collective NATO by far. And so I don't see the possibility of winning. Furthermore, the West or NATO needs to fight with Ukrainians, and we have also run out of Ukrainians. That it's they don't have enough men anymore, which is why you're seeing now the collapse beginning to intensify. So. So no, I would say, stick to my, well, I appreciate, of course, the other perspective. I would stick to my point that I think that this was a defeat. And even now with rearming NATO, I think it's going to be much more difficult, also because of countries like China, who was already started to put restrictions on certain rare earth minerals which you need for weapons production, such as antimony. And it's no, I don't see it. I don't think NATO could have stuck into this war for much longer, which is why I find the European idea that they can fight Russia now without the Americans to be quite ridiculous, because yes, the US is a very powerful country, and the idea that Europeans can do anything, even the logistics, without Americans, it doesn't seem very likely. And I think the main problem now for the Europeans is even greater. That is, now that if Ukraine is lost, it's also seen as being the loss of, as Poland's president said, the golden era of the West. That is, global hegemony is over. And when America leaves Ukraine, they will also leave Europe, which is why the Europeans are panicking, and even the Americans are realizing that in the multipolar system, Russia's become more important than the Europeans. So I think I see huge shifts towards this end. But I agree on the desperation, and the European buying, or Germany buying Russian gas from India. It's I think this is the best example of it. But no, that was my only comment.
I mean, I would just say quickly that, for the United States, I mean, Julian Assange said this, I think, in 2010 or something, that it's not about winning wars, it's about endless wars, right? So, I mean, it's not about defeating the Taliban, it's about endless war to fuel the military industrial complex and so on. And so certainly NATO can't defeat Russia, so I certainly don't claim that, but I do think that NATO could have continued to kill a lot of Ukrainians and fuel the war for many years. I mean, the U.S. couldn't care less how many Ukrainians died, and Blinken was trying to pressure Zelensky to lower the conscription age down to 18, right? I mean, so if Kamala Harris was elected, Zelensky probably would have done that. So, but anyway, I mean, it's a counterfactual at this point, because the U.S. has changed its foreign policy. So.
Yeah, but don't you think the fact that Trump and the US is opening up to Russia, isn't that indicative of a kind of Cold War triangular diplomacy that is tripolar in nature?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they said it, like Marco Rubio said it explicitly, that they want to end the war with Russia to redirect the resources towards China. So absolutely, but that doesn't mean, I mean, that's a change in policy, but that doesn't mean that it's a change in perspective, but it doesn't mean that it's a sign of U.S. decline.
Okay. So it's that kind of triangular diplomacy is just diplomacy. It's not really a triangular or a tripolar power structure.
No, I don't think so. Yeah. So again, so I think the distinction between relational power and structural power is useful. So in terms of relational power, things go up and down. I mean, U.S.-Russia relations might be better at some point and worse at other times. But in terms of structural power, nothing has changed, in my opinion.
Okay, interesting. So how do unipolar and multipolar systems impact smaller nations? Are smaller nations more likely to thrive or struggle under each system?
No, well, I think it's more likely to thrive. That is simply because in a let's say in a unipolar system, the former well, for example, a former central bank chief, he wrote a book when he was of Hungary. Sorry, he made this point that in the 90s, America was the only game in town, so you had to do what you were told, and this is. Yeah, to a large extent, how it works. The same applied, I guess, to some extent in a bipolar system, because then you automatically have to choose one pole or the other. So one you're cut off from, and the other one you become excessively dependent on. I think in a multipolar system, what you see, which is why a lot of countries are embracing this, is you have again the ability to have more political autonomy. That is, if you're not wedded only to one center of power, which is more powerful than you, thus you end up in this very asymmetrical, interdependent relationship. Yeah, you have the possibility to diversify, and I think this is why you have greater political autonomy. Why. This is why, yeah, Turkey would like to not just be linked to the West, but also China, Russia, and not have to pick one side. It's yeah, have this swing strategy. You see the same with Saudi Arabia, other Arab states. It's effectively, yeah, it's the one ticket to have a that not just this, yeah, not just medium-sized countries, but also smaller-sized countries can begin to gain more political autonomy. And I think this is important to pursue very basic national interests. So of course there's exceptions, but overall I think it's more beneficial with a multipolar system.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think the more multipolar the order, the more likely it is to be more democratic. So I mean, a unipolar order is likely to be imperial. And so, I mean, if you're a small country that's allied with the imperial power, in this case, the United States, and then you can certainly get benefits from that. But if you're a small country that's not allied with the US, then of course, you can be destroyed. So, and yeah, I mean, the more if it's truly multipolar in the sense that there's no one power that can dominate others, and everyone is roughly equal, or at least there's a large number of powers that are roughly equal, especially in the nuclear age, then I think that there is a greater incentive for all states to uphold international law, use the United Nations to settle disputes instead of doing it, bilaterally and so on. So the more multipolar it is, generally speaking, the fairer it is, which is precisely why. So I mean, I agree with Glenn that is certainly the BRICS Plus, they have an incentive for a more multipolar world order, so that's why they want to move towards that, even if I argue that they don't have the structural capacity to do that.
What do you make of the realist argument that multipolar orders are more unstable than other orders, like a bipolar order, for instance?
Well, I think possibly more when military power reigns supreme. I think now that again poles are more defined by economics, it's I think it provides more stability. So I guess this is an area where I would disagree, and you see this with yeah, again, as we've spoken about, the ability to avoid excessive dependence. Again, if you look at a lot of the economic statecraft in the 19th century, this was the main concern, that you didn't want to become too dependent on other states. Now, if you don't want to be too dependent on a more powerful state, again, this has been key concerns. It was the American concern of the British in the beginning of the 19th century. It was the French, Germans, dependence on the British. So you have two options. You can either pursue self-sufficiency, but we can't all be China, or you can diversify. And I think this is yeah, the main approach. And you need multipolarity for this. And I think yeah, this makes it a lot more stable. But um, yeah, simply, I think it also imposes more cost because, again, during the bipolar era, eh, I guess the example would be the extreme rhetoric you would sometimes have. You would have academics writing that, if the US would, for example, launch a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union and you got to knock out the Soviet Union completely while the US would only lose 20% of its population, that would kind of be a victory. And, this kind of thinking doesn't work if you have a third power. Uh, Again, this is a bit like in the 19th century. If the British and the Russians focus only on each other, you're going to have new centers of power, be it Germany, US, or Japan rising at the periphery. And I think you're going to have the same now. That is, there was more. Not everything is a zero sum simply because you have other actors in place as well.
Okay, so what role is Trump playing? Is he good or bad for unipolarity or multipolarity? Sean.
Yeah, it's always very difficult to talk about Trump, especially in the first couple of months. I mean, already in the first what is it, six weeks or whatever of Trump's term, he seems to have gone through two phases. I mean, I had a lot of hope at first, with the ceasefire in Gaza and saying he wants to negotiate peace with Russia and Ukraine. But it seems like the neocons in his administration are winning out now, and the more populist right, America First voices are being marginalized, and we kind of saw that in the Signal chat that was accidentally released to Jeffrey Goldberg earlier this week, where Vance, expressed some misgivings, saying it was a mistake to bomb Yemen because we're once again holding water for Europe, and Tulsi Gabbard as well. But they were, once it was clear that the neocons like Mike Waltz and so on were wanting to do this, and Pete Hegseth, they backed down, and so if we're returning to a neocon, I mean, even a more brutal neocon policy than under Biden, that's not good for the world, because big picture, in my opinion, as long as other countries like BRICS Plus, as long as they remain capitalist and they're integrated into global capitalism, which remains centered upon the United States, then they cannot challenge the United States. So they have to basically decouple from global capitalism in order to challenge the United States, for various reasons, like the role of the dollar and so on. They would really have to de-dollarize, but they can't do that on their own. And so if the US is going to be much more neocon and aggressive in its foreign policy, then that's only bad for the world.
Glenn?
I think, yeah, once you have a multipolar distribution of power, it's not so much about whether or not states want to pursue these policies. It's just if they don't, they get punished, which is why I think the United States under Biden, for example, when he said, no, we can go after China, Russia, we're the greatest power in the world, we can do anything we want. I think this leads to you get effectively punished by the international system, as the realist would say. So I think that Trump's instinct, I think in the first administration he spoke some to Kissinger, and I think that hopefully this affected him, because it does appear that he's quite aware you have to adjust, because under the Biden administration, the main idea was, we can knock out the Russians, and once they're knocked out, using Ukrainians, we can go after China. But now that this failed, I think Trump is effectively adjusting to the idea that you can't do this. This is a great power, and now you have to do the opposite, which is to reach out to the Russians and try to drive a wedge. Now, I don't think it's gonna work, but no, I think a lot of Trump's instincts are correct, but it still looks as if he's striving to restore the unipolar moment again. He wants to be all powerful. I think the approach, the economic war towards China is a good example. That is, if he accepted just normal multipolarity, the US could do many things. It could cut its debt. It could have a very aggressive industrial policy. It could, rebuild supply chains and but a lot of this would take many years. We're talking decades. But this idea that you have to break the Chinese at the same time, that you can't have this, China of equal power standing next to America. I think this is incentivizing overly aggressive policies, which results in sabotaging some for the United States as well, because the way it's trying to, decouple from China, I think it will bring economic disaster to the United States. So I do think that, that's some of the reluctance still to embrace, to acknowledge that the US should only be one among many great powers, that this is something that's gonna bring trouble to the United States. It should, in my opinion, aim to be first among equal, as a good ambition.
Okay. So what trends should we monitor to predict the future direction of global power dynamics? So what are the most important trends? What should we really look for?
Well, I mean, whether the BRICS Plus can actually challenge US structural power. So if we look at the four structures, so knowledge and ideology, like does the BRICS Plus have a coherent ideology that can challenge US conceptions of liberalism and free trade globalization and so on, although the US doesn't believe in free trade globalization anymore. But whether there's an alternative story that the BRICS Plus can tell to the rest of the world to attract influence, whether the BRICS Plus can de-dollarize, like to actually de-dollarize and to create an alternative currency, whether they can form a military alliance. I mean, I think the US has made it clear that they will use violence to protect its power. And so the BRICS Plus, if they're serious, they need to have a military alliance. But, China's foreign policy since 1949 is that they don't want to be entangled in military alliances. And of course, even though they're talking now, China and India still have border disputes and so on. And in terms of production, so in semiconductors, for example, whether China can develop its own photolithography machines in order to create the most advanced semiconductors, because ASML, a Dutch company, has 100% monopoly in extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, which are essential to make any semiconductors that are 5 nanometers or below. So that's why, like Huawei, for example, their smartphones have been stuck at 7 nanometers for a few years now. They can't make any more advanced, whereas the latest iPhone, I think, is 3 nanometers now. So whether they can develop their own semiconductor advanced technology. So yeah, I mean, I would just keep referring to the four structures. So production, finance, security, knowledge.
Susan Strange.
Well, I think on the free trade, the willingness to embrace free trade, I may be taking an overly political realist perspective, but I see this as being also a reflection of power. That is, once you have the technological dominance, and you have more of an incentive to embrace free trade. That is, there's a reason why the United States advocated for fair trade instead of free trade in the beginning of the 19th century when the British dominated. It's because you don't want your infant industries of being low quality and high cost to compete with the mature industries, which are then high quality, low cost. So I think once the United States became the dominant in not just having the leading technologies and industries, but also controlling shipping corridors and having the main financial powers in terms of the reserve currency and banks, they had an incentive to embrace more and more free trade because in a free market you have the ability to what's a good word to fill the other to saturate foreign markets and your technologies can outcompete the rivals. So I think that there's a reason why the Chinese Communist Party is more likely to embrace free trade now than the the American government with its liberal constitution. I don't think that's much ideology. I think it's just economic prowess which would dictate this. And I think one of the most important things is the key focus these days, which is repatriating a lot of the supply chains, because now that we're shifting a bit away into more economic nationalist policies, countries will see economic dependence for being vulnerabilities. That is, if you use other countries' currencies or technologies, it can be weaponized against you. So there's more focus now on shifting, on getting control over supply chains. The main problem, I guess, for the United States is that over the decades now, it created this international distribution of labor, in which it would have the top tier, often financial services, digital technologies, and then for example, well, simply put, that they would invent the iPhone and the Chinese couldn't assemble it. But now we see that the Chinese have climbed up the global supply chains, and they can compete the Americans on the top level. And I think this is very important if you want to look for signs of where this is going to go, because for the Chinese now, they seem to be able to do everything. They do the mining, very much so. They can do the processing, they can do the whole manufacturing process, and then go up to the innovative technologies as well. So they have and now they're connecting with much of the world through BRICS, so they're able to more put together these proper supply chains. Meanwhile, you see the United States, I think it will have huge problems because it outsourced not just its production, but it doesn't have the proper access to natural resources. And so I think the repatriation of supply chains is going to be much more difficult for the United States. And at a point in time when it's also look like it's facing also massive debts from this 30-year long party that they've been having, I think it's going to be very, very difficult time. So I would again look at repatriation of supply chains, the debt levels, and of course the technological competition, as we're kind of living in a new industrial revolution, which will transform a lot of the industries we have now.
What do you make of Glenn's argument, Sean? What does he get right? What does he get wrong?
So I'm mainly in international political economy, and I think we need to incorporate more realism, more focus on state power, balance of power, incentives, and so on. And so I think Glenn, is very useful in that regard. What does he get wrong? I mean, I have a particular understanding of the nature of global capitalism, and so I can't blame Glenn for not agreeing with that, because I don't know many people who agree with me in trying to understand how global capitalism is structured and how national power has changed in the age of globalization. So I mean, I argued that the U.S. is qualitatively different since 1945, but it's also been able to reshape globalization in such a way that, our old, which I mean, I didn't really talk about that much this time, but our old ways of measuring national power, which is national accounts, are no longer so relevant in the age of globalization. So just maybe getting more into IP debates would be helpful for realists.
So Glenn, what do you make of Sean's arguments? What does he get right? What does he get wrong?
No, I agree with most. I think perhaps Sean is more optimistic about the US ability to continue to hold on to control over economic institutions, the market dominance. I think that a lot of this was built on very specific structures which are falling away. That is, I tend maybe, but again, I have my own biases through very specific theories which I see the world. I tend to be very economic nationalist by nature. So I often I tend to look at how the US, for example, dismantled the dependence they had on Britain. In the American system, they had these three main pillars, which was the manufacturing power, which was a technology of the day. They wanted their own roads and ports, and when the railroad came along, that one too, and also a national bank. So you had these three pillars, and I see the same pillars being developed now by the Chinese, but also other countries. That is, first having greater technological autonomy away from the United States. Second would be these transportation corridors, not again the U.S. control over the seas, as Alfred Mann pointed out, this is key to hegemony, and this is also being weakened at the moment, especially the connection now with Russia and China. I think this is a very important one. And last is the financial, like the I guess the third pillar, which is also why you see why the banks and the payment system and currencies they're using, because a lot of they're still, even though using dollars, it's more and more being used. What is called cryptocurrency with the tether, for example, that is pegged to the dollar, but it's still taking off. So I think there's a learning process there, and but nonetheless a learning curve. But I think it's the focus on reducing dependence on the United States, which is a key objective if you want to construct a multipolar system. I think it's in full swing, and some things will go right, some will go wrong, some might take longer than expected, but I think this is the general path that they're currently on. But maybe, I think that's the main difference that we might have. But as I started off saying in the beginning, I might be proven completely wrong, so I'm not going to be, too too arrogant or confident that Sean is wrong and I'm right. So.
Anything else to add, Sean, Glenn?
Oh, it's fantastic.
You both agree that there are huge incentives, but you disagree on the actual capabilities. I think Sean is arguing that, despite the incentives, BRICS plus China or Russia do not have the capabilities, do not have the structural power, whereas you argue that they actually do have more capabilities than Sean is assuming, if that summarizes it. I don't know.
Yeah, because I mean, I agree with everything Glenn just said, but for me, that's evidence of enormous US structural power, right? And then we have to look at the other side, like, so, for China to really internationalize its RMB, I mean, it can't be such a huge surplus economy anymore. It has to be a deficit economy. It has to reduce its capital controls. But, the Chinese state has gone in the opposite direction. And from 2020, they've cracked down on their fintech and so on. They've tightened in 2016, they tightened capital controls after the financial crisis in Shanghai in 2015. So China's been going in the opposite direction. So I mean, there's no way the RMB can internationalize when it has such strict capital controls, because foreign investors can't move their money out of the country, right? And then we saw with the mess with Russia trying to sell oil to India. I mean, first India said they're going to use RMB, but then they decided no, actually they don't want to help China, so but they don't have enough rupees or rubles, and so they're selling rupees, but Russia doesn't want rupees, and so they're using like United Arab Emirate dinars. Like it's just an absolute mess. And so they just don't. There needs to be geopolitical and a geopolitical alliance for a common currency to actually succeed against the US, because of course the US is not going to just sit on its hands and allow other countries to challenge it. I mean, Saddam Hussein talked about selling his oil in euros. Gaddafi talked about selling his oil in some African francs, like a new currency. And so the US will ensure that oil from the Middle East is sold. I mean, Iraq just in July 2024, they said that they're going to sell their oil in RMB, and the US Fed said, well, we're going to cut off your oil revenues if you do that, your US dollar oil revenues. And so the Iraqi government had to change their mind and say, oh, no, okay, we're only going to sell our oil in dollars now. So, the US has enormous power to prevent other countries, especially in the Middle East, to sell its oil in any other currency than US dollars. And so, the oil is still the most important commodity in industrial capitalism, and many other reasons, right? I mean, so I just don't see any possibility for that to happen. And as long as the US dollar is hegemonic, so the US spent $5 trillion from March 2020 to March 2021. So it's 1 year across Trump and Biden. The US spent $5 trillion in COVID stimulus, right? I mean, this is more than what FDR could spend in the 1930s New Deal, right? This is the most US has ever spent in stimulus. And this is because of the rise of China, because China is such a huge export surplus country. In fact, 2024 was their record year for exports for China, right? And so there's no evidence at all that China is moving away from the US dollar. So, I mean, we see the same things. It's just, I see what what he sees, but then yeah, we like you said, we draw different conclusions. I see the status quo, um, and I guess Glenn sees the possibility of these huge power imbalances. So therefore, clearly the BRICS would want to change it, want to challenge it, but they just don't have the capacity to.
So is it a matter of them paying lip service to an ideology or rhetoric of de-dollarization and a new international order and so on and so on, but in reality they care more about bread and butter?
I think for Russia, definitely they want to de-dollarize. They wanted an alternative to the BRICS because obviously the U.S. has decoupled Russia from Western capitalism. But for China, yeah, I think actually they don't actually want to de-dollarize because I mean, China is. I mean, so the U.S. I argue the U.S. has benefited from the rise of China, but obviously the China has also benefited from the rise of China. So they benefit from this global capitalist system centered upon the United States. So yeah, there's very powerful interests in China that don't want to seriously challenge the U.S. because I mean that's why China is following U.S. sanctions on Russia and then on Iran.
Interesting. Glenn, any final words?
No, I think we will agree. I think Sean sees this as being more permanent. I see it as temporary because, again, the reason why the Chinese are restricted from or are feeling compelled to follow some of the sanctions is exactly because the dependence on the United States has compelled them to do so. And I think if the prediction is that the economic competition between the United States and China will only intensify, and the same could happen to them as seizing funds and all of this, which has happened to Russia, it just makes sense for the Chinese to intensify. This if not decoupling, at least diversification to reduce this excessive dependence on the United States. I think they will continue to make. To move in this direction. Doesn't mean they're not going to get there tomorrow, but I think this is the direction, and I think it's going to happen much faster than many expect. But again, we should do this again in like 2-3 years, and we can do an assessment if to what extent it went according to expectations. So
hopefully we're still alive.
Hopefully.
No nuclear war.
Yeah. Let's do this in 3 years and we'll see. All right. I think that's it. Very nice. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun. That was great.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. And John for organizing.
Yep. All the best and sleep well. It's quite late now.